Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Robbins, and welcome to LPLE from Dialogue FM. We're the podcast that lets you practice listening in English. We speak English slowly and clearly so that you can follow along and understand native English speakers more easily. I'm excited to help you improve your English listening skill, as well as help you learn new vocabulary, grammar, and idioms commonly heard in conversations among native English speakers. If you want to practice listening in English, then we invite you to join our conversation. Hi, Jane.
Hi, Jesse.
Today is a very, very special episode of LPLE. In addition to saying hello to each other, I'd like to welcome our guests to today's episode, Max and Clara. Why don't you give yourself a bit of a self-introduction?
Sure. This is Max. And we both work for the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, which is a nonprofit. And we do a variety of programs and activities and outreach. And my job is to do our government relations and community affairs work.
And my name is Clara. Thank you for the introduction. I run the adults programs at the Jewish Federation.
Fantastic. Now, Jane, if you remember, an episode or two ago, we talked about the holiday season, right? And in that conversation, we felt that there was a lot missing from the global knowledge of the holiday season in general, and more specifically in America, right? And so we thought it'd be a great opportunity for us, you and I, and more importantly for our listeners to learn a little bit about the other special holidays that occurred during this holiday season, one of which is Hanukkah. Now, I'd like to first ask you both, in the spirit of learning about this holiday, what is the correct way to pronounce Hanukkah? I've seen it spelled many different ways, pronounced many different ways. What's your take?
So there are two ways of pronouncing Hanukkah. The first H is actually in Hebrew the letter Het, which is a little bit more throaty. It comes from the back of your mouth, like Het, like you would say Johann Bach, or some German words have similar sounds to them. There isn't an equivalent letter in English, so when you say Hanukkah in English, you can say it either Hanukkah with that throaty sound in the beginning, or Hanukkah just with an H.
And the more guttural way of pronouncing Hanukkah with the het, like ch, there are lots of other Hebrew and Yiddish words that have the same pronunciation, like challah or chutzpah or other words like that. It's the same idea.
And I've seen Hanukkah spelled with a C and without the C,
Yes.
so that supports exactly what you're saying.
Yes.
So there are, probably about, I don't know.
I counted eight, yep.
8 different, all correct ways to spell Hanukkah.
Because it's not an English word.
Yes.
Well, if I may, in the spirit of learning a new language, I'd like to try to pronounce this correctly. Hanukkah.
That was right.
Did I get it?
You did.
Oh, excellent.
You're going to make me do it now?
Yep.
Say it again, please.
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah,
That was right.
more or less.
Now, if and when the conversation about Hanukkah comes up in conversations with friends, how would you describe it? What's the common way that you both socially describe this particular holiday?
So Hanukkah is an 8-day festival of light. The word Hanukkah actually means dedication. And the story of Hanukkah took place 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. And throughout Hanukkah, we celebrate light and we celebrate liberty and freedom.
Excellent. So what about you? Like when you describe it, how do you describe it to your friends?
Sure. I think often in the same way that Clara would, but it's about celebrating the miracle of the light as well. And I think the story of Hanukkah, while it is minor in terms of Jewish holidays, fits in with the theme that you could attribute to many Jewish holidays, which is our history of oppression and violence as a people. But in a more light way, sometimes we say, they tried to kill us, we lived, let's eat. And that is, there was a king under the Syrian Empire at the time who was outlawing Judaism, I'm sure among other religions, and commanding all people to pray and obey the Greek gods. So temples were desecrated, people were killed, and there was a group of soldiers called the Maccabees, which literally means hammer, and they were able to take back the temple and regain their freedom. And so it's about freedom, but it's really about when they went to light this light that's in all temples. It's called the Ner Tamid, and it's an eternal light that's always burning. And so back then they lit it with oil, and there was only enough oil to light it for one day. But they needed to. They went to get oil from where they could, and the oil lasted the 8 days needed. This amount that was only supposed to last for one day lasted for 8 days until they could get what they needed. And so I think really just going in the spirit of freedom and liberty and light, and in this very dark season, that's appropriate. Though I do want to mention one important detail, which is that though this was a military victory, one of the core tenets of Judaism is to never celebrate war or death, even that of your enemies. And so it's not really about the military victory, it's about the miracle of the light and the spirit of freedom and liberation. Now, considering that, of course, this tradition of celebrating Hanukkah has carried on for how many years, you said?
Ever since then, so 2,000 years.
Or 2,000 years. In its current form, please explain the basics of where, when, how is this holiday celebrated in its modern day form?
In America first, and then other countries, if you know.
Sure. So Jews will celebrate Hanukkah by lighting a menorah, which is a special kind of candlestick with 9 branches. And we light one candle for each night. So the first night you'd light just one, and the second night you'd light 2, and then the third night you'd light 3, and then the last night you light all of the candles. That's the only really religious observance that happens, and there are accompanying blessings and songs that you can sing. Other than that, we celebrate with oil because of the oil lamps. So we'll eat a lot of foods fried in oil, such as potato pancakes called latkes, or sufganiyot, which are jelly-stuffed donuts. There's also a traditional game that we play with a little square top called a dreidel. And it's actually a gambling game where kids will win chocolates or candies by playing this game. And there's a story behind the game as well, where when Judaism was outlawed, people would gather to study Judaism. And when the soldiers would come by, they would all be pretending to play this gambling game instead of studying. Mm-hmm. So it was a cover, if you will. Other than that,
Well, the dreidel itself has a Hebrew letter on each side, and each stands for a different, you win some, you lose some, that sort of thing. But there's a phrase that goes with it, and the letters are Nun, Gimel, Hey, and Shin from the Hebrew alphabet, and they stand for Nes Gadol Haya Asham, which means a great miracle happened there. So that's part of it. Also, you asked how Hanukkah is celebrated, around the world. So, in the world, there are about 40% of the world's Jews in the U.S. and about 40% of the world's Jews in Israel. And then the other 20% are scattered all over the world. Some in Europe, some in South America, some in Australia, in India, really, Japan, everywhere around the world. And so each country probably has its own small adaptations that may have come about based on the other holidays that happen around the same time. But I think the core traditions practiced across the world are the eating of fried foods and the lighting of the candles. And at our holiday party this week, we had some interesting trivia about both Hanukkah and Christmas. And so one of the questions was, how many donuts, how many sufganiyot are eaten in Israel over the Hanukkah celebration? And I think the answer was 24 million. It was a lot of donuts. Yeah.
I don't know how I've lived 35 years of my life not realizing that all of my favorite foods are served during Hanukkah.
This could be a good holiday for you.
Very much so. Well, I take it you're in the 8 days of Hanukkah, or when does that start?
We are not yet.
This is a good question. Something I think that is important to touch on is that Hanukkah is not happening yet, but it moves every year. So in the Jewish calendar, which is based on a lunar calendar, it's the same time every year. It's the 25th day of the month of Kislev. But here in the calendar that we use, it can start, I think last year was maybe the earliest it has started in a long time. It started the night of Thanksgiving.
Whoa.
And it can start, and this year it does not start until the 24th, which happens to also be Christmas Eve.
There you go.
So it has started, I think, as late as maybe the 26th of December. So there's a really wide range of dates in there.
When we talk about how Hanukkah is celebrated globally, did you come across any unique traditions that stood out to you in terms of how another culture celebrates Hanukkah? Like, was there any slight difference that you thought, oh, that's really cool how they celebrate it over in Japan or in India?
Because there aren't a whole lot of religious texts that one goes through on Hanukkah, the celebration varies household to household, not even country to country. Here in Seattle, as a great example, we have a fairly large Sephardic population here.
Do you want to explain what that means?
The Sephardic Jews are those coming from the Mediterranean and South Europe and North Africa, whereas a lot of what we consider quote-unquote traditional Jewish ideas are the Ashkenazi Jewish traditions, which come from Eastern and Western Europe. And there's a large Sephardic population in Seattle. I think we're actually the third largest in the United States,
yes,
second only to New York and Los Angeles. And if you attend a Sephardic service on Shabbat, which is our holy day, the service is very different. They speak a different language than Ashkenazi Jews, called Ladino, which has a lot of roots in Spanish. So those traditions are very different than what you would see in an Ashkenazi household, but there's still the same themes of light and of freedom and liberty throughout the holiday.
And I think that's one of the really beautiful things about Judaism too. I won't go too off base, but I had the opportunity this summer to go to a diplomatic seminar in Israel for a couple weeks. And there were 26 of us from 22 countries around the world. And so getting to learn about the Jewish communities in India, in Uruguay, in Panama, in places where growing up, I don't conceive of there being a Jewish community really, but feeling this connection and practicing the same traditions and having the same cultural ties is something that I think binds us together as a people all over the world. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the menorah, and there's eating, there's playing with the dreidel. Holiday is celebrated in the house with family.
Yes.
Right? And unlike maybe the Christmas holiday where sometimes it's just people gathering at one house for one day, maybe two. This is 8 days. So is that also happening where families gather for 8 days?
Definitely. Families won't necessarily gather for all 8 days together, but they'll gather for some of the 8 days. There are lots of Hanukkah parties that happen, bands that are playing. There are public menorah lightings all over the city that happen either on individual people's front lawns because they happen to have large menorahs or with Jewish community groups around the city. I did a quick Google search actually before I came over here and just looked up public menorah lightings, and it came up with lists and lists and lists of them.
In Seattle?
All over the city. In Issaquah, in Shoreline, in downtown Seattle, in Queen Anne, in Bellevue, everywhere.
So there's private ways to celebrate with family, but it sounds like there's clearly public ways for the community to get together, both Jewish and perhaps even non-Jews, to come and learn.
Definitely.
To celebrate, but also to learn more about the Hanukkah holiday.
And non-Jews are definitely welcome.
Clara, why don't you, I think this would be a great place to mention a few big events that we are helping plan over the course of the next couple weeks for Hanukkah. And Clara's been spearheading these, so I'll let her take the lead.
So actually there are already some Hanukkah events taking place in the city. We have a program called PJ Library, which does story times and song sessions for young children in bookstores and community centers around Seattle. We have a couple of Hanukkah-themed story times that have already started happening. There are a couple of bands that are coming to play, including a great klezmer band playing at the Science Center. Their Festivals of Light. The Seattle Children's Museum Festivals of Light exhibit has a klezmer band, Orchestra Farfalla, on December 26th. There are also concerts happening from the Seattle Jewish Chorale. There is a large party happening December 29th up in Ballard called Bubby's Old Fashioned Hanukkah Shindig, which is a Yiddish term.
For grandma.
Yes. Bubby is Yiddish for grandma.
Okay.
That's a great time. There's a couple of different klezmer bands and performers who are going to be there. There's a LGBTQ Hanukkah party on Capitol Hill. And
if you go to our website, jewishinseattle.org, you can find a listing of all of the community Hanukkah events happening that have already happened, that are happening in the next few weeks. Lots of good stuff.
Well, that's actually a good segue into learning more about your organization. Now, could you share with us and the listening audience more about what your organization does, how long it's been around, what your main focus is, and why you both decided to work there?
That's a good question. The Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle was founded in 1928 to care for the Jewish community here. And how we do that has shifted somewhat over the years, from financial to programming to advocacy, all sorts of different things. And I think it's important to note that Jewish federations are core community convener. That's a phrase. Core community convener organizations all across the country. So there are 151 federations in the United States. Some states like Florida, who have a large Jewish population, have 8 federations of varying sizes in varying cities. Here in Washington State, we have one here in Seattle that serves primarily the Jewish community of Puget Sound, but also, as we're able, we do outreach with the Jewish communities across the state. And so we do a variety of programming. One of the things we do, I'll talk about my role since it's not programming primarily, and then Clara is one of our head program leads, so I'll let her talk about that. One of the things the Jewish Federation in Seattle has done here for the last 30 years or so at least is advocacy. So that's my primary job. I work on behalf of the Jewish community as a whole. Social justice, and what we call tikkun olam, which is a commandment to repair the world, among many others, are very high up in importance in the Jewish faith. One of my favorite phrases is a Jew is asked to take a leap of action rather than a leap of faith. And so because of that, I think and many other commandments, advocacy and social action is really a critical, important part of what it means to be Jewish, and trying to leave the world a better place for our children than we have it today. So that's a very large part of the work I do, and I was inspired to do it because I care a lot about policymaking and the positive impact it can have on our communities. And I'm a Seattle native, and the Jewish community and my family and my values have played a large role in making the person I am today. So it's a great opportunity to get to bring together those values that drive me in a way that I feel is impactful, and do that work on behalf of the community.
That's great. That's great.
So I'll say a little bit about our programming work and our engagement. We have a huge array of programming that we run out of the Jewish Federation. I am responsible for most of the adults programs that we run. So I have a social networking group called PAVE for 30s and 40s. We have professional networking for tech professionals, for lawyers, for Jews in health and medicine. We have a young adult leadership development class. We run Israel programs for young families and young kids. PJ Library is one of our biggest initiatives here in Seattle. We focus on literacy and community building for young children by sending Jewish-themed children's books to families. We also do scholarships for kids and teens to go to summer camps and to Israel trips, and just a huge variety of other things, including some of Max's work, educational and advocacy events. And it's really incredible the breadth of the work that we do at the Federation, particularly because we are a relatively small staff. For me personally, starting to work at the Federation was an interesting journey. I was raised Jewish, but my mother is not Jewish, and Judaism travels matrilineally through your mother. There's this interesting tension in the Jewish community because we are both a religion and also a culture. And you'll find this in the Jewish community too. There are lots of different people who identify as different sects of Judaism, whether they're Orthodox or conservative or Reform or Renewal or Reconstructionist. But there are also a lot of people who identify as quote unquote just Jewish or culturally Jewish, or I'm not really that Jewish. And you hear all of these people defining themselves in these ways that sound guilty. They sound like they feel bad that they're not doing the religious part of Judaism as much as they should be. And this is something that really bothers me, and it really gets under my skin, because I think that those people are just as much a part of the Jewish community as anybody else. So that's been one of my big motivators for being a professional in the Jewish community, is really reaching out to those people who don't speak Hebrew or weren't raised in a religious Jewish home or don't keep kosher or cover their heads or any of these markers that you think of as traditionally Jewish, and to really open up our community to make those people welcome and to let them know that they do have a place in our community.
I wanted to ask about the Hebrew. Of course, we know that in Israel, people speak Hebrew, and a lot of people who went to Israel, I'm assuming, didn't necessarily know Hebrew when they went there. Is that true? I'm not sure that's true. And the second question is, when someone does a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, they're 13, 12 years old, they have studied Hebrew for quite some time. Is that right? Before they can actually go through their bat mitzvah ceremony. Is that correct?
Yes.
So do they actually speak it? Would you be able to speak it on the street, for example? Or do you sort of just know the texts? Or
So the question about Hebrew in Israel, I think, is really interesting because Hebrew is, I think, the only completely ancient language that died and has been totally revived as a modern language. So what you speak to when you say, do people visit and they don't speak Hebrew? I've been to Israel twice, and I unfortunately speak like tiny, tiny, tiny bits of Hebrew. I can say sorry because I'm really clumsy.
That's important.
Yes. But so there are kind of two ways in which we use Hebrew. There's the conversational way, like in Israel and in in community and conversations, and then you have what you have in synagogues and temples. And so when one is studying for a bar bat mitzvah, he or she does study Hebrew. They learn the prayers in Hebrew, they learn the songs in Hebrew. But what we often end up with in the United States, and I'm a perfect product of this, is I went to Sunday school and Hebrew school, growing up. And my Hebrew school teachers hopefully are not listening to this. But basically, I can read Hebrew, but I don't understand what I'm reading. I can pronounce it, I can say it, I know the letters, I know the vowels, but I don't understand the concept of what I'm reading. And so, though you do study for a bar bat mitzvah quite intensely and quite significantly up to it, a lot of it is learning what you need to know for the ceremony in and of itself. And so that's my experience. What about you, Clara?
So there are actually two variations on Hebrew. There's biblical Hebrew, which is what our texts are written in, what the Torah scrolls have. And there's modern Hebrew, which is what's spoken in Israel on the street, or here, if you find Seattle actually has a very large Israeli population. And I think it's predominantly because of the tech center here, but there are a lot of Israelis settled here in our community. And that's a different version. It's not quite as distinct as you would say Old English from Shakespearean plays versus modern English, but it's along those same lines, the difference between the two languages. I will agree with what Max said earlier, that you'll find a lot of Jews with varying levels of Hebrew many Jews study Hebrew from when they're very young. But if you only study the biblical Hebrew, you may or may not have conversational Hebrew skills. The two are different skill sets.
Well, for the listening audience who's here, who wants to learn more about all things related to your religion and culture, how can they come to the Federation? How can they reach out and learn more about you guys?
For starters, it would be a great thing to check out our website, which is www.jewishinseattle.org. There you'll find events listings of all of the events that we have coming up. I would say some of the easiest ways to get involved if you are coming from a place of not knowing anything about Judaism might be the program that I mentioned earlier, PJ Library. PJ Library runs weekly song and story times in public spaces, cafes or bookstores, and it's a really fun, happy occasion. There's a storyteller and there's a circle of kids and everybody's dancing and waving their little scarves around, and there's music, and each of the storytellers that we employ has a different style. But, some of them will be speaking in Hebrew and getting the kids to be repeating Hebrew words back. Some of them are Spanish. There's sign language that goes on. One of the Hanukkah-themed story times would be a lot of fun, but we do special story times for most of the holidays that happen around the calendar year. And then the parents are there also, and there's a chance to meet other people in the community. They also happen in 11 different locations around the city, so a lot of the people who attend the story times are people who live in that neighborhood. So it's a really great way to meet your neighbors, people who live near you, and connect in that way as well. If you don't have children, PAVE, the program that I mentioned earlier, does a lot of purely social events, whether it's hikes or happy hours at the bar. We also do some cultural and educational events, holiday celebrations, things like that. So there are different entry points for whatever you may be looking for.
And lots of synagogues and the University of Washington and many other schools offer an Intro to Judaism or a Judaism 101 class. So if that's something you are interested in, please reach out to us at the Federation. Though we may not provide all of the programming one is interested in, we are a great connector to everything that the Jewish community has to offer. And many of our congregations around the area do lots of interfaith events. In our advocacy work, we do interfaith events. So there are lots of ways to get involved. And the last thing I might mention is that if you know anybody who's Jewish, feel free to ask them questions, about what holidays are about or what customs, they grew up with or are important to them. I think a lot of the mystery and in some cases misunderstanding too, is just from a lack of communicating. So the more we can share our customs and traditions with one another, I think the less of that we'll have for sure.
For those listening across the world, we have the fortune of having an audience in parts of Europe. I recently saw a new subscriber from Nepal.
Wow.
We have subscribers in Japan and Vietnam. Maybe to end on the note that you mentioned, Max, this is a great opportunity after you've listened to this episode to make new friends by asking them about their culture and their religion, and fostering and promoting and accepting and respecting that element of understanding the other person. As I listen to how you both explain the Hanukkah holiday, again, we talked about the fact that we don't know much about it, but there's clearly things I like about it already. And I'll mention that I'm going to seek out many of the foods that you
Fried chicken's acceptable too.
There you go.
Fried in oil.
But if anything, what I find even more enjoyable is hearing what makes members of the Jewish community happy in celebrating this particular tradition. One final question. What does 2017 hold for holidays and celebrations for the Jewish community?
Well, if you're looking at the whole of the year, then all of them.
Yeah.
We have Tu B'Shvat is coming up in February, which is the birthday for trees. On the Jewish calendar, there are 4 different year markers, similarly to how we have the school year versus the calendar year versus the fiscal year. This is the birthday for the trees in how you're counting how old trees are. And we celebrate Tu B'Shvat by planting trees, by learning about our environment, and by praying and eating certain foods that are local to Israel. We also have, in the spring, the biggest holiday that most people will be aware of is Passover, as you mentioned earlier, which is a week-long celebration again. We have several minor holidays that are scattered throughout the year. There's Purim, there's Tisha B'Av, Tu B'Av. In the fall, there's the high holidays, which are our 2 biggest holidays of the year, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is literally the head of the New Year. It's our Jewish New Year. And then Yom Kippur is 10 days following. It's the Day of Atonement. The story behind the 2 is that on Rosh Hashanah, it's a celebratory holiday. On Rosh Hashanah, your fate is written. And then you have 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to atone, to apologize to the people that you've wronged throughout the year, to think about your year and make amends or make goals for the next year. And then on Yom Kippur, the Book of Life is sealed. So you have a 10-day grace period in between to change things. The fall is actually our big bonanza holiday season.
Too many to count.
Yeah,
really.
The high holidays are followed very quickly by Sukkot, which is a week-long harvest festival, and then Shemini Atzeretz and
Simchat Torah.
Simchat Torah, which are the next week.
And Simchat Torah is, one important thing, the Torah is our holy book, and it's made up of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but we read the Torah from start to finish, the same portion every week, every year. So Simchat Torah celebrates, is it the first new portion? Is it the first portion or the end of the Torah? I can never remember.
So Simchat Torah is very exciting. It's the new year for the Torah. So
Yes.
it's you roll through the Torah over the course of the year, and then at the end of the year, you have to unroll the whole Torah and roll it back up the other direction so that you can start at the beginning again.
Literally scrolls.
Literally scrolls, yes. It's a little
And
bit
you
more difficult
celebrate
than a book.
Thanksgiving too, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yes, we do. And all of the other American holidays.
Well, this is exciting because when we learn about all of the other holidays, much like a person studying the English language who talks to a friend who they find out is Jewish, and they learn about these holidays, it just opens up the opportunity to learn more about those holidays. So in that regard, Jane and I would love to have you both back to talk more in depth about those holidays as well, and to learn about those special traditions and customs that come with each of those holidays.
We would love to be back.
Thank you so much for having us.
Max,
Thank you.
Yeah, Max, Clara, thank you both very much. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and of course the LPLE audience thanks you as well, and we will see you again soon. Thank you for listening to this episode of LPLE. Let's practice listening in English from Dialogue FM. Subscribe to LPLE on iTunes to hear the latest episodes, or listen to past episodes on our website, dialogue.fm. That's dialog.fm. If you have questions or comments about English, or if you would like for us to use a word, grammar, or idiom in our conversation so you can learn how to use it correctly, we would love to hear from you on Twitter at dialogue.fm or Facebook at facebook.com/dialoguefm.